Welcome. You found your way to a quieter corner of time. As the world around you slows down and the weight of the day begins to soften, we invite you to step gently into the distant past. Tonight, your journey takes you to the Middle Ages era, veiled in mist and myth, where stone castles cast long shadows over muddy villages, and life moved not in hours and minutes, but in seasons and harvests. But rather than kings or knights or sweeping battles, our focus will be a little different tonight. We'll wander down quieter paths and peer through crooked timber doorways into the world of children, those smallest souls who were born into a world far more unforgiving than our own. Their days were often shaped by cold, hunger, obedience, and labor. Joy, too, could be found, but it was fleeting and sparse, like sunlight through a narrow window. Let your breathing slow. Allow your thoughts to soften and gently drift with us as we explore what it truly meant to be a child growing up in the harsh, demanding world of the Middle Ages. Imagine, if you will, the earliest moments of your memory. Perhaps they are gentle, filled with warmth, soft blankets, lullabies, and the scent of home. Now step back through time farther still, until you find yourself in a low-ceilinged cottage, its walls built of wattle and daub, its roof thatched and damp from a night of mist. The floor is packed earth. The air smells faintly of smoke and animal fur. You are no longer in the modern world. You are a child in the Middle Ages. You wake not to the sound of alarm clocks or cartoons, but to the crow of a rooster and the shuffle of feet across creaking boards. The morning is cold, even in summer. Your blanket is a coarse, itchy wool, and there is no fireplace in your sleeping corner. If you are lucky, you sleep in the loft above the animals, where their warmth rises slowly through the boards. There are no toys in the way you might expect. No coloured plastics, no gentle melodies. Instead, you might have a carved wooden figure, passed down or made by hand, a doll stuffed with rags, a knuckle bone from a sheep, or a hoop to roll in the dirt lane. Your clothing is simple, often handed down from older siblings' woolen tunics in shades of brown or grey, coarse and scratchy, patched again and again by your mother's hand. You have no shoes, not unless your family is better off than most. You go barefoot through mud, straw, and icy puddles alike. Breakfast is not cereal or toast. It may be a hunk of coarse rye bread, dipped in watered ale if you're very young, or porridge made from whatever grains are left in the larder. You eat quickly. There is no lingering. Then, the day begins long before school bells and playtime. If you live in a village, your morning tasks might include feeding pigs, collecting eggs, fetching water from the well, or helping tend the garden. Children were not sheltered from labour. You were expected to contribute, and there is little rest. The idea of childhood as a protected, carefree time simply didn't exist. Once you could walk and carry, you were useful. By the age of 7, many children had job scores, duties, even formal apprenticeships if you were male and your family had the means. Girls learned to spin, sew, and churn butter. Boys might begin learning a trade or follow their father into the fields. There was play, yes. Children are resilient, and moments of laughter could be found in chasing chickens or balancing on fence rails. But leisure was a luxury, not a right. And always, there was the threat of illness. No child went untouched by the fragility of life. Colds could become deadly, cuts could fester, a fever could mean the end. Most children did not survive to adulthood. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, families loved fiercely. Bonds were formed quickly, and childhood, though brief and shadowed, held small joys. Watching candlelight dance on a wall, the rhythm of a lullaby hummed low, the quiet closeness of family huddled together in one room against the cold. As you picture these children barefoot in the mud, peering wide-eyed at the fire, fingers stiff from early chores, you begin to feel the weight of their world. Not in sorrow, but in understanding. Their lives were real, their days were long, and yet they endured, just as children always do. Let us now move gently into the next layer of their world, the milestones and transitions that shaped their short but poignant paths. From baptism to apprenticeship, we explore what it meant to grow up, step by step, in an age both distant and deeply human. In the hush of a dim stone chapel, where incense mingled with the chill of ancient walls, the life of a medieval child began not just with birth, but with baptism. Within days, sometimes within hours, newborn would be carried to the local church. The journey might be short, a few muddy steps from cottage to chapel, or it could stretch across a countryside road, hurriedly made in bitter weather. The urgency was not symbolic. Infant mortality was so high that delaying baptism was unthinkable. The rite was seen not only as a religious duty, but a safeguard for the soul. A baby baptized was a baby saved, even if its life were to slip away that very night. The child's name was bestowed, then chosen from saints or ancestors, rarely whimsical or unique. Names like Alice, John, Matilda, or William echoed through generations, passed down like prayers. In that moment, the child became part of something larger, a parish, a lineage, a spiritual community. Yet this sacred welcome marked only the beginning. Childhood in the Middle Ages was less a stage and more a bridge, always leading swiftly to duty. There were few formal age brackets. Life unfolded in stages defined not by years, but by abilities. Around the age of 7, a noticeable shift occurred. In many parts of medieval Europe, this was considered the age of reason, the point at which a child was seen as capable of understanding morality and accountability. Confession began then. So did firmer discipline. It was also the age when many boys would leave home for apprenticeships, especially in urban areas. A blacksmith might take in a boy to train him in the ways of hammer and forge. A merchant might house and instruct a lad in counting, selling, and etiquette. The apprenticeship was not school, though lessons were learned daily. It was a contract of obedience and service, often lasting 7 years or more. In return for labor, the master offered shelter, food, and skill, sometimes kindness, often stern correction. For girls, the path was quieter, but no less rigorous. They learned to keep house sewing, spinning, preserving, kneading dough. If from a noble family, a girl might be sent to live in another household, to serve and be educated in courtly manners. Education, in the sense we know it, was rare. Most children never held a book. The alphabet was a mystery. In villages, only priests and clerics read fluently. A wealthy merchant's son might learn his letters from a tutor. A noble's child, if fortunate, might learn Latin and French. But for the vast majority, knowledge was practical: how to milk a goat, patch a thatch roof, or bake bread by feel rather than recipe. Religious life shaped all these milestones, from feast days to fasts, from the ringing of bells to the whispered words of catechism. The church wove through every age and every rite of passage. Saints' days marked time. Holy days brought brief reprieve from work. Puberty brought more than growth. It brought responsibility. By 12 or 13, girls might be married. Boys nearing 14 could be expected to take on adult labor, to fight, to wed, to bear the weight of family survival. There were no teenage years as we know them, no long span of trial and identity. Instead, there was childhood, and then there was adulthood. The shift was swift and unforgiving. Still, within this structured rhythm, small joys endured. A gift of sweetmeats on a feast day. The first time a child was trusted to mind a sibling or tend the fire. The sense of growing, of being seen not just as small but as valuable. For many children, becoming useful was the closest thing to praise. It was a badge of honor, worn not with pride, but with quiet endurance. And so, in the flickering light of hearth and candle, the child aged, not always slowly, not always gently. But each milestone was met, as it had been for generations, without fanfare, but with a quiet stepping forward into the next necessary shape of life. As the years passed, their childhood faded not into memory, but into the bones of routine. What began in baptism would endoften too soon in a burial watched by the same church walls that had first welcomed them. Let us now drift toward the places where mystery lingers, where archaeology uncovers the remnants of these children's days, and where we, centuries later, can still glimpse the shapes of their lives through toys, graves, and forgotten tools. If you were to walk today across a grassy meadow in rural England, or through the remains of a crumbling monastery in France, you might not know that centuries ago, children's feet once ran there. Laughter, cries, quiet gamesall vanished into time, but the earth remembers. Archaeologists have uncovered the subtle echoes of medieval childhood fragments that tell stories in silence. Small things, often broken, worn by time, but unmistakably shaped by young hands. A tiny leather shoe, no longer than your palm, buried beneath layers of soil in a London courtyard, its stitching still faintly visible, its sole worn thin. The child who wore it likely lived in the bustling 13th century, surrounded by cobbled lanes and merchant stalls. A simple shoe, but rich in implications. Someone cared enough to craft it to size, to lace it with care. Nearby, in the remnants of medieval middens refuse heaps discarded over generations, lay traces of toys. Spindle whorls shaped from bone, carved dolls without arms, wooden balls, whistles, even small dice. These weren't always for play in the modern sense. Many were miniature tools or tokens used to prepare children for adult roles. A toy spinning wheel was both entertainment and instruction. In cemeteries, the traces are more solemn. Child graves from the Middle Ages are abundant, testifying to the high mortality rates of the time. Infants and toddlers buried in churchyards, sometimes with tokens, a pilgrim's badge, a small cross, or a handful of beads. These burials remind us that even in an era of widespread hardship, children were mourned. In York, England, a mass grave dating to the time of the Black Death held remains of numerous children, carefully arranged. Analysis of their bones revealed signs of malnutrition and illness, confirming the fragility of life, but also present were signs of care, bodies aligned with precision, heads gently cradled. Even amid despair, someone had buried them with tenderness. And then, there are the hidden messages in buildings themselves. In castles and manors, graffiti scratched low on stone walls, too low for an adult's hand. Figures, animals, names etched with patience, perhaps while a child waited during long days indoors. In monasteries, novices, often boys no older than 10, left notes in the margins of manuscripts, doodles beside Latin verses, a face here, a bird there, proof of minds wandering, even in cloistered halls. Even more evocative are the traces of children's labour. In rural France, archaeologists discovered impressions of small hands preserved in dried clay tiles. The tiles had been left to cure in the sun, and while they did, children must have played nearby. They left palm prints, toe marks, the sweep of a finger then wandered off, unaware they had written themselves into the future. These findings ground the abstract past in tangible form. Through them, we sense not just what children did, but how they lived. They were not always passive recipients of hardship. They made choices. They played when they could. They etched themselves into stone and earth. Their legacy is not only in the grand halls of history, but in the dirt beneath our feet and the fragments held in museum drawers, in the texture of a smoothed-out bone toy, in the angle of a child's shoe, in the whisper of handwriting shaped by a learning hand. We often think of the Middle Ages as a time of great distance, cold and grey, filled with war and shadow. But the fragments left behind by children are deeply human. They remind us that tenderness existed, even when the world was hard, that even in the absence of comfort, there was curiosity, that even when life was brief, it was lived fully. As we move forward, let us step into the homes of the elitist, rarefied spaces of noble families where childhood was different, but still shaped by expectations, constraint, and the passage of time. Now, imagine that same medieval world, but this time, not from a cottage or village, but from within the thick stone walls of a noble household. Picture vast halls echoing with footsteps, banners draped along stone, and heavy wooden beams overhead. Here, the life of a child was different: warmer clothes, better food, and a roof that did not leak. Yet privilege came with its own form of pressure. Children born into the aristocracy were not raised to explore who they might become. They were groomed to fulfill a role. From the moment they could walk, their futures were largely predetermined political tools, heirs, or wives-to-be. A noble boy might be taught to read and write, though the focus was often on Latin and scripture. Alongside that came training in manners, weaponry, and strategy. Before the age of 10, many boys were sent away to serve as pages in another noble household. There, they would observe and learn how to serve a table, care for a knight's equipment, and carry themselves with the dignity expected of their rank. These households were both schools and proving grounds. The training was formal, disciplined. At age 14, a page could become a squire, attending a knight in battle, and learning the art of warfare firsthand. Knighthood, if achieved, was not just a title, it was a duty, a life committed to loyalty, to service, and often to conflict. For noble girls, life followed a different, but equally scripted path. From early childhood, they were taught skills suitable for high-born women: embroidery, music, courtly manners, and the management of households. Reading might be allowed, even encouraged, particularly of devotional texts, but the education had limits. A girl's mind was shaped as carefully as her appearance to be pleasing, modest, and prepared for marriage. Betrothal could come shockingly early. A girl of 7 might be promised to a lord she had never met, as a political alliance. The marriage would come later, often in her early teens. The child might be moved to her future husband's household to begin her preparation long before vows were spoken. Despite the richness of surroundings, noble children were not always surrounded by their parents. Child rearing was often the domain of nurses, tutors, and stewards. Emotional bonds between parent and child could be distant, formal. A father might see his son as an heir first and a boy second. A mother might see her daughter through the lens of strategic matchmaking rather than maternal closeness. That said, there were moments of comfort: a warm fire in a decorated chamber, silk-lined cradles, the luxury of music lessons and books, even access to early forms of medicine. But illness knew no rank. Plagues crept through castles as easily as they did hovels. Noble children died young, too, and their absences were mourned with both private sorrow and public ceremony. Life in a castle or manor house could be both suffocating and spectacular. Children were expected to behave, to represent their house, to rise early and speak properly, to kneel when required, to understand the intricacies of etiquette before they truly understood themselves. Play existed, but always within boundaries. A child might play chess or engage in practice tournaments. They might learn to hawk, to ride, to dance, but spontaneity was rare. Even games served a purpose to prepare for diplomacy, for court life, or for battle. Yet even in these environments of grandeur and control, children found ways to be children. Letters from the period occasionally include descriptions of laughter in corridors, teasing among siblings, or mischief during solemn ceremonies. Humanity, after all, is not erased by wealth or protocol. It is tempting to envy the noble child-warm beds, tutors, meals of roast meat, and honeyed wine. But their lives, too, were shaped by duty, by expectations older than they were. Their paths were carved in stone, and though the walls around them were tall and strong, they could feel just as heavy as poverty's burdens. As we step away from these lofty halls, let us now descend back into the shared spaces of childhood, into the festivals, games, and traditions that briefly softened even the hardest lives, binding all children, rich and poor, in the fleeting joys of play. Though the Middle Ages were often marked by struggle, they were not without moments of laughter, especially for children. Play was not just a luxury of the privileged. It was a natural, necessary rhythm of childhood, even amid hardship. In village greens and castle courtyards alike, children carved out spaces to play, to imagine, and to feel, even briefly, free. Games were simple, but spirited. They required little in the way of materials, and much in the way of energy. Blind man's bluff, tag, leapfrog games still known today filled moments between chores and lessons. Children chased each other through fields, ducked behind trees, and played pretend with sticks, stones, and scraps. In towns, streets became playgrounds. Children rolled hoops with sticks, tossed balls made from tightly bound cloth, or played at mock sword fights with wooden blades. These games, while playful, often echoed adult roles. To be a knight, a trader, or even a farmer in mimicry was to understand one's future before it truly arrived. Toys, when available, were modest. Whistles carved from bone, miniature carts, spinning tops, rag dolls, or even carved animals on wheels. Some were gifts from adults, others were handmade by the children themselves. These objects were rarely preserved, but when they are found in archaeological sites, their simplicity speaks volumes. Yet the greatest delights came during festival times, when the ordinary rhythm of life was paused, and the whole community, from eldest to youngest, celebrated. The liturgical calendar was filled with feast days: Easter, Christmas, All Saints, and more localized saints' days, each offering their own traditions. For children, these were magical times. Special foods, lively processions, bright colors, music, the arrival of traveling performers, jugglers, musicians, dancers, a wonder in itself. Children gathered wide-eyed to watch tricks and listen to songs. One such celebration, the Feast of Fools or Boy Bishop Festival, offered a rare inversion of power. In some parts of Europe, a child was chosen to act as a mock bishop for a brief period, wearing robes, blessing villagers, and parading through town. Though symbolic and humorous, it offered children a moment of elevation, of being seen and honored in a way daily life rarely allowed. Religious pageants, too, involved children as actors, angels, or members of choirs. In monastic communities, choir boys sang in candlelit services, their high voices echoing through stone chapels, creating moments of reverence and awe. Even within the grind of daily labor, moments of levity surfaced, a joke told while turning the churn, a race to fetch water, a shared smile over a misshapen loaf of bread. Play wasn't something children waited for, it was something they wove into the spaces between tasks. And for children of all classes, nature was a constant companion. Streams to wade in, trees to climb, fields to explore. Seasons shaped their games. In winter, frozen ponds became places for sliding or crude skating. In summer, there were flowers to pluck, berries to find, insects to chase. Despite hunger, despite fear, despite expectation, there was always play, sometimes hidden, sometimes brief, but always essential. And it's in those small, joyful moments that the human thread shines brightest. They remind us that no matter how long ago, or how distant the world may feel, the core of childhood curiosity, delight, wonder, remains beautifully unchanged. As we move onward, let us now explore how these same children were disciplined, shaped, and sometimes even harmed by the beliefs and practices of their time, stepping gently into the shadowed side of medieval parenting and punishment. In the quiet of a thatched roof home, or the echoing stone of a castle corridor, the voice of authority held weight. Childhood in the Middle Ages was bound not only by hardship and ritual, but also by the strict expectations of behavior. Discipline was not merely correction, it was considered a moral obligation, a shaping of the soul as much as the body. Children were expected to be obedient, quiet in presence, modest in speech, diligent in duty. This was true across class lines. Whether the child of a farmer or a baron, obedience was seen as the gateway to righteousness. In a world built on hierarchy and faith, to obey was to belong. Parents, teachers, priests, and masters were tasked not just with raising a child, but molding them into productive, pious adults. And often, that molding was done through correction that modern sensibilities would find harsh. Corporal punishment was a common tool. A switch cut fresh from a tree, a cane hung by the hearth, a sharp rebuke or public humiliation. These were not considered cruelty. They were part of a broader system of moral education. To spare the rod, it was believed, was to spoil the child. Schoolmasters, where schools existed, wielded authority with unquestioned severity. In grammar schools, young boys might be beaten for speaking in the vernacular rather than Latin. A mistake in recitation could bring swift discipline. Even noble children were not exempt. Tutors were granted wide authority to correct their charges, and few dared protest. Within the home, discipline varied. Some parents likely showed gentleness and patience, as humans always have. Others, burdened by their own hardships, may have wielded discipline more sternly. Religious texts and sermons urged strictness as a virtue. Children, it was said, were born with sinful natures. Correction was a form of love, intended to save their souls. Chores, too, were a form of discipline. They taught order and respect, repetition and humility. Tasks had to be done a certain way, at a certain time, and mistakes could be met with sharp words. In some apprenticeships, the environment verged on punitive. Children were sometimes beaten, overworked, or even neglected, with little recourse. And yet, discipline was not without tenderness. Medieval manuscripts occasionally reveal a softer image, letters in which parents express worry, concern, or gentle advice to their children. In illuminated texts, images show mothers cradling babies, fathers guiding sons. The tone of these records varies, as it does in any era, from household to household, heart to heart. The church also played a role in moral formation. Confession began early, and children were taught to examine their thoughts and actions. Sin was not an abstract idea, it was part of daily life. A child who lied, stole, or defied might be reminded of eternal consequences. This too shaped the medieval child's understanding of discipline Nino, just as punishment, but as spiritual correction. In monasteries and convents, young novices lived under the ruler strict code of silence, labor, prayer, and obedience. While often voluntary, these environments could be austere. A missed chant, a misplaced item, or a moment of pride might lead to public penance or solitary reflection. Even games and festivals had rules. To cheat or disrupt could bring scolding or exclusion. Children learned early that community required conformity, and that to misstep, even in innocence, was to invite discipline. But despite this rigid framework, children adapted. They learned the rhythms. They found quiet ways to rebel, delaying a chore, whispering during prayer, sneaking a moment of rest. The human spirit, even when young, finds ways to stretch beneath constraint. It's important to understand that while discipline in the Middle Ages was often harsh, it came from a cultural belief in its necessity. The goal was not cruelty, but control. And in a world where danger was constant, where survival depended on order, many adults believed that to discipline was to protect. Still, as we reflect on this facet of medieval childhood, it's a sobering reminder of how far we've come in recognizing the emotional lives of children. Today, we see children not merely as future adults, but as whole beings in their own right. That recognition was rare in the medieval world, but not entirely absent. In our next segment, we'll return to a place of learning and structure, not the home or the field, but the growing world of medieval education, where books were rare, teachers demanding, and learning was a privilege few could reach. The image of a medieval classroom may seem distant from today's rows of desks and digital whiteboards, but in quiet halls of stone, beneath flickering candlelight, and the ever-present scent of wax and parchment, children did learn, though rarely, and not equally. Education in the Middle Ages was a narrow road. Most children, particularly in rural areas, never learned to read or write. Their lives were governed by the seasons, not syllables. The field and the hearth were their classrooms, and their teachers were parents and neighbours. But for a select few, mostly boys of the clergy, the nobility, or wealthy urban families, the pursuit of knowledge began early, and often harshly. In monastic schools, the day began before sunrise. Bleary-eyed boys would rise with the monks for matins, the first of many daily prayers. Afterward, they might settle onto hard benches in cold rooms, where lessons in Latin grammar, scripture, and moral instruction filled the hours. The primary language of instruction was Latin, not the vernacular spoken at home. This created a sharp divide between everyday speech and scholarly learning. To speak one's mother tongue in class was often met with punishment. Silence was prized. Curiosity, if it strayed from the lesson, was discouraged. Books were precious and few. Before the invention of the printing press, each one was copied by hand slowly, painstakingly, by scribes in monasteries. Most children never touched a book, let alone owned one. Lessons were memorized through repetition, recitation, and the ever-present fear of error. The discipline was mental as well as physical. Mistakes in declension or verse could lead to sharp rebuke or worse. Yet amid the rigidity, some students thrived. Those with aptitude and patience could rise far, from grammar school to cathedral school, and for the most fortunate, to university. Girls were largely excluded from formal education. Exceptions existed. Some noble women received private instruction, particularly in reading devotional texts. A few convents offered education to girls, especially those who would take the veil. There, they learned scripture, music, embroidery, and basic literacy, though always framed within religious life. Even so, the yearning to read was not limited by gender. Some children, even in humble settings, learned through observation or secret instruction. Marginaliathos doodles and notes in the corners of manuscripts sometimes show small, clumsy hands trying to write their names, a sign, perhaps, of a child watching, mimicking, and hoping. Outside the walls of schools and monasteries, learning took other forms. Apprenticeship was a kind of education, too, though its lessons were not written on pages. A boy might learn to measure cloth, to tally prices, to keep accounts in the merchant's house. A girl might learn to read a recipe or recite prayers from memory. Churches were also places of learning. The priest, often the most literate person in a village, might teach a few children the basic show to form letters, how to read from the Psalter, but this was rare and always secondary to spiritual instruction. Education was seen not as a right, but as a privilege and often as a tool. It was meant to serve religion, law, or commerce, not personal fulfillment. And yet, in the quiet of those cold rooms, beneath the stern eyes of teachers and tutors, children slowly learned to form ideas, to ask questions, even if silently. And so, the seeds of thought were sown, slowly, sometimes painfully, a letter traced with a quill, a prayer whispered in Latin, a number counted on one's fingers. For many, this was a new flicker of knowledge in an otherwise physical world. As we move toward our final thematic stop, we look beyond the home and school, beyond the festival and the field, to one of the most somber realities of medieval childhood, the briefness of life itself. In the next segment, we explore how the Middle Ages faced the frequent loss of children with grief, with ritual, and with the quiet endurance of those left behind. As the soft rhythms of medieval life unfold of labour, learning, laughter, and discipline, there is one truth that lingers in every shadowed corner, woven into the very breath of the age. Childhood was perilously fragile. From the moment of birth, a child's survival was uncertain. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. Illnesses without names swept through households. A simple fever, a cough in the night, a wound untended each could quickly become fatal. Modern medicine did not exist. Physicians were few, and their knowledge limited. Remedies leaned heavily on herbs, charms, and prayer. Midwives and wise women were often the most experienced healers, but even they could only do so much. The Church advised both practical and spiritual cures, prescribing fasting, confession, and the blessings of relics. Disease took no account of age or wealth. Plagues, most famously the Black Death, struck entire families. Burial records from the mid-14th century show clusters of child deaths, whole households silenced in a matter of days. But death was not always sudden. Malnutrition wore children down slowly. The ache of hunger, the toll of hard labour, and the weight of cold winters chipped away at tender bodies. In poorer villages, hunger was a near-constant companion. And yet, in the face of this relentless fragility, medieval families responded with rituals, beliefs, and a kind of sorrow that, while often less outward than today, was no less real. Baptism was not only a rite of welcome, it was a shield. To die unbaptized was to risk eternal separation from God, and this fear pressed heavily on parents. It's why infants were rushed to churches, why midwives were sometimes granted the right to perform emergency baptisms themselves. When a child died, the response was shaped by faith. Funerals, even for the very young, were solemn and sacred. The child's body might be wrapped in cloth, sometimes simple linen, sometimes something more ornate, depending on the family's means. Burial took place quickly, often in the churchyard, and frequently in unmarked graves. In wealthier households, children might be buried with small tokens, perhaps a bead, a carved figure, or a folded prayer tucked into their wrappings. Parents mourned, though the expressions of grief were tempered by doctrine. The Church urged acceptance, viewing death not as a cruel theft, but a divine transition. Children who died in grace were thought to enter paradise, spared the trials of earthly sin. Still, the emotional toll was deep. Some records describe mothers withdrawing in silence, or fathers who donated alms in a child's name. In monasteries, monks recorded the passing of novices with notes of sorrow. Even amid a world so accustomed to death, each loss marked a shift in the household, an absence felt in the routine of everyday life. Art and literature of the time reflected this awareness. Paintings occasionally depicted the dance of death, a reminder that mortality touched all, from kings to infants. In illuminated manuscripts, small illustrations showed souls lifted by angels or cradled by saints. Some parents named a new child after one who had died, a gesture both hopeful and bittersweet. Others made pilgrimages in memory of a lost child, lighting candles in distant shrines or leaving votive offerings in quiet chapels. And through it all, life continued. Brothers and sisters still played. Fields still needed tending. The cycles of birth and death, joy and grief, wove tightly together in the medieval world. To be a child in the Middle Ages was to live in the company of risk, but also resilience. Their stories, so often lost to time, live on in fragments and rituals, in the worn stone of churchyards and the ink of forgotten letters. As we prepare to close, let us step back from the past and reflect on the long journey we've taken through homes and fields, books and festivals, joys and sorrows, and gently compare it to the safety and softness of the world we now inhabit. Now, as our journey through the childhoods of the Middle Ages comes to a close, we return slowly gently from that distant world of stone cottages and candlelit chapels, of muddy fields and cold hearths, of play and prayer and sorrow mingled in equal measure. You've walked the path of a medieval child from their earliest breath, cradled by uncertain hands, to their quiet labour in homes and fields, to their fleeting joys beneath wide skies, and, for far too many, to an early and tender farewell. Their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, by nature, by custom, by the deeply rooted structures of a time that did not yet imagine childhood as we do today. There were no soft playgrounds, no universal schooling, no protections written into law. Childhood was short, urgent, and often silent. And yet within all of that, there was life. Resilient, earnest, deeply human life. Children found ways to smile, to pretend, to grow. They dreamed beneath thatched roofs. They whispered secrets during chores. They traced shapes in the dirt, sang small songs at twilight, and left behind impressions in stone and memory. Today, as you lie safe beneath soft blankets, the world around you steady and warm, you are held in comforts those children could not have imagined. Medicine, food, books, laughter without fear. Their lives cast shadows that now allow us to see the light in ours more clearly. History, especially when it whispers rather than shouts, has a way of deepening our perspective, not to alarm us, but to calm us, to remind us of the strength that resides in endurance and the quiet beauty in lives long past. So rest now, knowing that you've listened well, that you've honoured those small voices from long ago. Let the past settle gently around you, like dust in a sunbeam. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts drift soft and far, and allow the weight of centuries to fade. The bells of the village are silent, the hearths burn low, the fields lie still beneath the stars, and the children of history, those who once ran, worked, played, and dreamed, sleep, at last in peace. Good night.